For a time, it looked as if Russia was teetering on the brink of civil war. Mercenaries from the Wagner group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, seized the southern city of Rostov-on-Don and its military headquarters and shot down 3 helicopters. Next stop on what he called a march for justice was Moscow itself. Prigozhin was, in essence, declaring war on the defence minister, Sergei Shoigu, on the head of the armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, over their handling of the Ukraine war. As the Russian capital fortified itself, President Vladimir Putin made an ashen-faced emergency address to the nation, calling for unity and decrying Prigozhin's efforts as an armed mutiny and a stab in the back. Yet that very evening, Prigozhin announced that he was ordering his forces back to their bases in the south. The Kremlin let it be known that criminal charges against him would be dropped. It appears the coup d'etat was averted thanks to negotiations led by the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko. As part of that deal, Prigozhin is said to be moving to Belarus. But this has not been a show of strength by Russian hardman Vladimir Putin. Far from it. And whilst Prigozhin stopped his efforts 120 miles from Moscow, it will have felt a lot closer than that. On this episode, we'll be asking why the mutiny ended almost as quickly as it began, what this means for Putin, and what effect, if any, this will have on the conflict in Ukraine. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Let's begin, shall we, with our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay. Diana, you're speaking to us from Moscow where, what a difference half a day makes. In the morning, Putin describing what was going on as a criminal adventure, a grievous crime, treason, blackmail and terrorism. And then that evening, they're back to being best mates again. What on earth has been going on?
Well, let's not call them best mates. I think that relationship is very much over, the Wagner-Putin relationship. They weren't great pals anyway. It wasn't as though Prigozhin had a direct line to Vladimir Putin. I think that's why he screamed and shouted as much as he did on social media. But he is certainly out of favour now. But I think it is incredible that, the Russian president made the kind of backtrack he did, that asked Lukashenko to make this deal for him, because for Putin, treason is a cardinal sin. So he does look very weak if 6 hours later he turns around and says, oh, don't worry, we'll drop charges and you just go off to Belarus. Although, incidentally and interestingly, Neil, it looks as though those charges may not have been dropped. There's some reporting from Kommersant, one of the big papers here, from their security sources, that the General Prosecutor's Office is still investigating Wagner. So we're trying to dig into that too. But at least the fact of the matter is that if Prigozhin goes to Belarus, then I'm sure that he will be told to stay very quiet for the time being there.
Did Vladimir Putin really think that there was an existential threat to his continued existence as Russian president? Did the Wagner Group really possess the capability of taking the Kremlin?
Well, I think that the Wagner Group is much smaller now than what Prigozhin suggested it was. He said he had 25,000 armed men. I'm sure it is not that. And the sort of extent of that convoy that was making its way up the M4 from Rostov through Voronezh and on to Moscow was never really quantified, although estimates are it was more likely 10,000 than anything else. But I think the consensus now is that Prigozhin did overestimate, that he wasn't really very clear about what his target was, because exactly what was he going to do when he arrived in Moscow? Go and storm the Ministry of Defence? Try and sort of rip Shoigu out of his office if he was there? None of it really seemed very strategic, and he would have needed probably a lot more support and heavy weaponry than he had.
I suppose it is important as well that Prigozhin was very specific in those that he was criticising. It was the Ministry of Defence, it was the military chiefs. It wasn't, as far as I could tell, by name Vladimir Putin himself.
Yes, because I think Prigozhin understands the way the system works, and that this power vertical means that you have to try and maintain that relationship with Putin. And I think he genuinely was angry at Gerasimov and Shoigu. He has been there with his men in the trenches, talking to them, fighting in Ukraine, seeing that the war was not the war that was sold the Russian people, and that's why he was so angry. So I think it was genuine, the fact that he wanted the top military brass to pay for the kind of loss that his forces and the Russian army had sustained on the battlefields of Ukraine.
Yeah, and certainly no coincidence that there are pictures purporting at least to show the Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu out there in Ukraine at the moment, showing the people in Russia that perhaps they shouldn't be listening to Yevgeny Prigozhin. The unfortunate fact of the matter is, however, that plenty of people have been listening to him, and I just wonder what the mood is like in Moscow amongst ordinary Russians right now.
So I think they've been rattled. It was an extraordinary day. No one could really work out what was going on. And I think the Russian people are used to a million different sort of possibilities of reality, because they're fed a million different possibilities on television, and they love conspiracies. And I think no one can quite work out what was what. But for the people in general, actually, this was just one day, a blip, and I'm sure it will be forgotten. I mean, amongst the elites, who I think this will have sunk in more, the fact that this could even happen, there will be a lot of questions being asked.
Well, what is the current state of the Wagner Group and indeed the standing of its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin? We know that he has been sent to Belarus. We haven't seen him yet there at the time of recording. I mean, is he entirely neutered now as a threat to Vladimir Putin?
Well, he always would pitch himself not as a threat to Vladimir Putin. And I think that is genuine. I don't think Prigozhin is out to become president of Russia, but he is out to secure a sort of proper position for himself. Wagner has always had these mercenary operations in Africa and other countries, and they've been very useful for the Kremlin. So it's an open question as to whether he will be allowed to carry on that kind of activity on the Kremlin's behalf around the country, or whether this Kremlin Prigozhin relationship is severed altogether. I doubt that Prigozhin is going to go quietly. And there's also a part of me that wonders whether, given the speed at which everything was resolved, and if Prigozhin is still actually proves himself to be on Putin's side, could he be useful in Belarus for the Kremlin, given the fact that Belarus is coming increasingly under Kremlin's control in any case? I mean, it's a far-fetched theory, but I mean, anything's possible, right, in modern Russia. But I think that the sort of analytical consensus seems to be that essentially he's in disgrace, he's in exile, he is presumably in Belarus, and that he is out of sight and out of mind at the moment, and the Ministry of Defence can get on with what they were trying to do over the last couple of weeks, which is form some kind of unity out of the disparate band of forces that have been operating in Ukraine, because Wagner wasn't the only mercenary group there, and carry on with everything. But I mean, it's quite difficult to carry on with everything, given this momentary, because it was pretty momentary, but this momentary mutiny from within.
Such has been Putin's grip on power that the possibility of a coup, even one with the shelf life of Prigozhin's, has resulted in plenty of Western commentary suggesting this could be the beginning of the end. That certainly seems somewhat premature, even if Putin's standing has undeniably taken a knock. Remember, for all of Prigozhin's complaints, the war in Ukraine continues, and continues bloodily. Dominic Waghorn is Sky's international affairs editor. I spoke to him on the road to Kyiv.
It's been a roller coaster ride for the Ukrainians because, of course, they've had a year and a half really without any grounds for optimism, really. And then, obviously, hopes raised massively by this extraordinary news, this extraordinary 24 hours in Russia over the weekend. And, I mean, Ukrainians often say to us that the only good Russian is a dead Russian. I think they were relishing the prospect of many more dead Russians being created and killed by Russians. And I think by the end of the day, they were massively disappointed.
Well, just on the military point then, Dom, I'm wondering what the withdrawal of tens of thousands of the Wagner Group's troops, what effect, what material effect that might actually have on the tempo of the conflict.
It's unclear so far, and it's not really clear what's happening to Wagner. I mean, the mercenary army was on a kind of timeout from the war anyway, but it was expected to go back quite soon. And Wagner has been the most effective fighting force in this war. And therefore, if they're not going to be a kind of coherent fighting force, if they're going to be absorbed and swallowed up by the army, which seems to be what this deal is that's been done between Prigozhin, their leader, and the Kremlin, if that happens, then that weakens the Russian war effort. I think the other real question about this is also in terms of the Russian war effort is what happens to Sergei Shoigu and also to Valery Gerasimov, the defense minister and chief of staff. They're the two men that Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, basically launched this armed mutiny to try and oust. So far, they remain in post. They're not regarded as very competent. They're, I think, valued by Putin more for their loyalty than for their military competence, given the extraordinary set of setbacks that have plagued the Russians for a year and a half of this war. Were they to be replaced by more competent leaders, that would be a problem for the Ukrainians. No sign of that yet. And I think it's difficult for Putin to replace them immediately because that would be a sign of weakness. It would be giving in to Yevgeny Prigozhin's demands.
Dominic, when you poke a bear, it tends to respond, at the very least lash out. Given the events that we've seen over the weekend in Russia, I'm wondering what the military response has been directed towards Ukraine over the past 24 hours.
Well, the only news we've had from the front are from the Ukrainians. The Deputy Defence Minister says that since the counteroffensive began, 130 square kilometres of territory has been retaken. I think we can treat that with a pinch of salt. That may be an exaggeration. An interesting development is between Kherson and the dam that was blown by the Russians. There's a key bridge, an important strategic bridge, Antonivsky Bridge. And the reports today are that the Ukrainians have got across that bridge and formed a bridgehead on the other side, which potentially gives them an opportunity to puncture through probably a more exposed flank of the Russians, where there's some disarray after they blew up the dam, or the dam they are believed to have blown up. But in terms of sort of the to and fro of action across the front, despite the counteroffensive beginning 2 weeks ago, there's not an awful lot of momentum, it seems, picked up by the Ukrainians. They say there have been no significant changes for the last 48 hours. So far, the armed mutiny and the events in Russia have not had any difference, made any difference militarily on the ground here.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, I mean, there is a man who understands, the value of good and bad PR. I mean, if the Ukrainian capital, if the Ukrainian president isn't trying to exploit this display of, what to me does seem like weakness on the part of Vladimir Putin, I'd be very surprised.
I mean, he certainly is, as you'd expect. Over the weekend, he said it was a sign that Russia is in chaos, that no one's in control, and he said it's of paramount importance that the West brings as much pressure to bear on Russia until international order is restored, as he puts it. And he's been on the phone to Western leaders over the weekend. I think there's probably a fear, this is just a suspicion on my part, on the behalf of the Ukrainians, that the West looks at what happened over the weekend and is worried. They were worried by the prospect of complete chaos breaking out in Russia. Had this led to a total breakdown, had Wagner's troops ended up in Moscow, paralysing the city, had they even decapitated the Putin regime, you could have seen a nuclear-armed superpower descending into chaos. That is one of the nightmare scenarios, as well as the use of tactical nuclear weapons, that I think is giving sleepless nights to planners in Washington, London, and other capitals. And I think the Ukrainians will feel this is possibly overthinking it, and they wouldn't want any of those nightmare scenarios to put the West off, giving them the support they crucially need at this very important moment in their campaign, as they try and make their counteroffensive press home and gain some kind of traction in their war against the Russians. So, yeah, absolutely. He is making the most of this in terms of PR, but also I think back channels privately with Western leaders, urging them not to lose their focus and keep supporting them at what is a very important time.
And what then of Belarus, the place to which we are told Prigozhin has been headed? I know in the past Belarus has been used as a staging post for Russian troops before they're entering Ukraine. I mean, it does feel like there may well be a situation in that particular country we might have to come and deal with at some point.
One of the great mysteries in this is what's going to happen to Yevgeny Prigozhin. One of the sort of more conspiracy theories is that this is all part of a ruse to get Prigozhin based in Belarus, where he could then support some kind of flanking movement while the Russians are defending their positions in the south. He could lead some kind of advance from Belarus. I mean, for me, that seems a little far-fetched. There are simpler ways of getting him to Belarus than the crazy events we saw over the weekend. But I think it will be a fear to the Ukrainians that they've got someone who is brutal, violent, arguably quite psychopathic, very successful in organising soldiers and led them to the biggest successes we've seen in this war in terms of what the Russians will be doing. To have him on their northern border, I think, is a worry. So they will be keeping close eyes on him. I think the question that's really preoccupying Ukrainians here is this is clearly weakened Putin. And I think they probably will agree this is the beginning of the end for Putin. But more broadly, they know that they're on a clock. They know that time is running out for them. They know that Western appetite for supporting them is not infinite, that one of the likely prospective candidates in the American election next year, Donald Trump, can't even say which side he supports in this war. And I think, therefore, even if Putin's days are numbered, they know that they've got a narrowing window of opportunity, and they need the West to do as much as they can to support them and make the most of any advantage that this gives them.
I mean, certainly the rest of the world will have had to check themselves and their view of Vladimir Putin, given what they saw over the weekend. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the West and its allies are any less fearful of him as a result of what we've seen, surely. I mean, you've had Vladimir Zelensky talking in public about Vladimir Putin, the US Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary here in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. But we should be in no doubt, this still remains an incredibly dangerous, incredibly powerful man.
Absolutely. And, the system beneath him may be showing cracks. The structure of power in Russia may be showing enormous fissures now. But he has outfoxed probably the gravest threat that he will face as Russian leader, certainly up to this point. He's outmaneuvered a warlord who was advancing on Moscow with, it seems, 5,000 to 10,000 battle-hardened mercenaries. And very unexpectedly, he's managed to persuade them to swerve away from that and effectively back down. So from Ukraine's point of view, if he's survived the gravest threat yet, what is going to threaten him in the future? And of course, he's weakened, possibly terminally, but that may take years to play out, and I don't think they've got years left. In a sense, the emperor's clothes are being exposed here. I mean, I think a lot has been said about Vladimir Putin being someone who, in his own autobiography, talks about he saw a rat in his flat in St. Petersburg, and he learned from the way the rat, when cornered, lashed out and fought back. And I think he's created this impression of him that when cornered, he could do something that's deranged and unexpected. And that has kind of led to the mystique of Vladimir Putin and the fear of what he could do if he loses too badly in Ukraine, and could he use a nuclear tactical weapon. Well, when cornered in Moscow, he didn't sort of do anything desperate. He simply negotiated a way out and kind of gave concessions. He compromised. So that possibly weakens the mystique of Vladimir Putin. But as you say, he remains in power. He remains as the leader of a powerful military that is well dug in Ukraine and so far is showing no signs of being beaten.
And anyone who suggests with authority that the events of the weekend will bring a speedier end to the conflict in Ukraine, well, I'd suggest similarly, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, it does remain to be seen. I mean, there are reasons to be cheerful if you're Ukrainian. Wagner force looks like it's being dismantled. The two men who run things in Russia in a military sense remain in power. There is a sense of weakness now about Russia, and I think there's a sense that things are moving in their direction. And it's certainly given them great encouragement, I think, and grounds for hope. But there's no reason to believe that we should then rush to conclusions here. We spoke to some Ukrainians who were at the site of where a missile struck outside Dnipro over the weekend, before the coup had fizzled. So you'd have expected them to be rather jubilant and celebrating, but not a bit of it, really. They were pretty sceptical. They said, we've heard all this before. We've heard that Putin's finished or he's ill. We're not going to celebrate this. And if Russians want to kill each other, well, that's up to them. I think the sense here is that they'll believe it when they see it. Their hopes have been raised a number of times here, and they remain sceptical. And I think that scepticism has proved to be well-founded. So anyone looking at this should accept one of the main rules about looking at events in Russia is they are never quite what they seem. They are unpredictable. And I think it is far too early, really, to say how this will play out for Russia and for the war in Ukraine.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. My thanks to Dominic Waghorn and Diana Magnay. You can scroll back just a few episodes to find Diana's reflections on 10 years of reporting from Russia. That was recorded before the events of the weekend. Go a bit further back and you'll hear again from Diana about Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner group leader. This edition was produced by Emery Woodhouse. Our editor is Dave Terrace.